Welcome to today's session on realistic load testing in Power BI. Quick show of hands, has anyone heard of load testing before? Done any load testing in Power BI? We wanted to? Okay. Before I jump into it, just a quick intro on myself. My name is Matt, and I'm a bit of a Power BI enthusiast. You can find me on my socials there. All the slides, all the Power BI files, all of the scripts will be on my GitHub, so please go check that out if you want any of that. I also co-organise the Newcastle Power BI user group, so if you're ever up in the northeast, please do come along, check us out. We meet once a month. So, what's on the menu for today? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about what load testing actually is, why we should even care about it or need it, and then we're going to look into some demos on how we can actually do that in Power BI using the realistic load test tool. And then we're going to add in some more realistic usage scenarios rather than just a plain demo. I'm not really going to talk about troubleshooting performance issues or even performance tuning in Power BI in general or anything around licensing. And there's plenty of other sessions that focus on performance and DAX. This is more going to be about how to actually load test reports so you're ready for production. So who recognizes this? It's the performance analyzer in Power BI, right? This is probably every Power BI developer's go-to first check to see if we've got a performance issue on a report page or a visual. And you might do something like this, where you refresh your visual. Is that playing? No, it's not. You refresh your visual, you open up the performance analyzer, and then you find the visual that's slow, and you take out the DAX query, and then you put it into something like DAX Studio, and you try and find out where the issue might be, right? This is probably quite a common scenario. That's probably your first step. What I'm going to show you today is more, you don't think you've got any performance issues on a single report page, or even a single report page visual, but you're not really sure how it's going to cope when you throw it into a production environment, and you've got 5, 10, potentially even 20 users all accessing the report at the exact same time. So load testing sits within this family of performance testing. Commonly, these types of performance testing you might do on other applications. Spike testing, for example, is where you might hit a website with loads and loads of traffic to see how it copes. I don't know if anyone tried to buy Taylor Swift tickets last year, but that was probably a failure to do some spike testing. Load testing, on the other hand, is a bit like this classic bridge builder game. I used to love this game at school. I don't know if anyone else played it, but essentially you would build a bridge with as few resources as possible, and then you'd send over some cars, some trucks, some vans, a plane, whatever, and you would see how it coped. And then you'd get little stress markers to see, oh, maybe it's going to collapse or not. And that's basically what load testing is. We're specifying a load up front, typically with some realistic conditions, so what our production environment looks like. We're predetermining the parameters on that, so how many users, how many refreshes, etc. And then we're testing a pass or fail scenario, so does our report perform under that specified load, or does it crash, or does it just not meet our SLA of our performance? Stress testing, on the other hand, is more like your classic game of Buckaroo, where you're just adding and adding and adding load with no idea when it's going to fail, but you'll find out. So we're not predetermining any parameters, and we're testing the point of failure. So this graph kind of sums it up. With load testing, we're using an expected load, so we're predetermining. Stress testing, we're adding and adding load until we hit that breaking point. So, load testing in Power BI, what does it test? Well, typically, we want to look at our front-end report performance because that's what users are actually going to see. They don't really care if our DAX measure runs really well when we're testing it in the data set. All they care about is whether that visual is actually going to load or not. So that's what we're testing. We're also doing this in a realistic scenario, or as realistic as we can be. So rather than just refreshing a page over and over again, we want to look at things like bookmarks, filters, slices, any way that a user can interact with a report. We want to try and embed that into our load testing as well. And as I mentioned earlier, we're not really looking at individual query or DAX performance here. This is all just about how quick does my page load, or the visuals within that page load. So I wouldn't really recommend to use this for individual performance testing or anything such as syntax, visual errors, access, or security. So hopefully that kind of sums up what load testing is. Now you're probably wondering, well, why should I care about this, Matt? I'm already doing my UAT. I'm already doing unit testing. I've got all these different types of testing that I have to do, and I just need to get it into live. Well, there's a few reasons why we should care about load testing and why we should always implement it before going into production, and that's because we want to avoid production pain. Production pain, I mean, we lose things like adoption because our reports are slow. We struggle to keep up with deployments and timeframes around those because we've got errors that we need to fix, we've got hot fixes that need to go through. We've got dependencies, if you have one data set with multiple reports connected to it. And capacity conflicts. You might have one report that really causes you an issue, and that actually causes other reports to throttle in the service because your capacity is at its limits. I had a scenario at work just a few weeks ago where an SME was actually running a demo of a report, and in this report it was a big matrix visual, and on each cell there was a tooltip on the visual. So on each cell, when you hovered over, it would bring up another tooltip, and that tooltip page was really, really slow. And I was looking at this 5-minute time frame and seeing over 2,000 requests on this report. And I was like, how has someone clicked through a report that quickly? And it caused the capacity to pretty much come to a standstill for that 10, 15-minute period, which just so happened to be when another area of the business was doing training, and then another live report was being used. So it's not just within your actual report that you need to think about, but if you are in a premium capacity or fabric capacity, these are all things that you want to avoid, and you can do that in load testing. We also don't know how our code is going to change. We don't know how the data volumes of our data sets might change, the logic, the model size, and these changes over time can be quite difficult to spot, especially when you've got a report that was fine to begin with. The common scenario is, oh, well, it worked yesterday before I deployed my code change. We can do that regression testing with load testing to see after a code change has happened what the performance impact is. And you can also use this to save a bit of money. We all know how much Power BI Premium and Fabric costs, but what I'm going to show you in a little bit is a demo on how we can actually scale the capacity up and down and do load testing at different levels to see how your report performs at different levels. And rather than just guessing what your optimal SKU level is, you can actually decide that using some load test results. Okay, so hopefully I've sold it to you a little bit. How do we actually go about doing some load testing in Power BI? Well, firstly, we need to assume that there's no significant performance issues in our report to begin with. You know, if you've got a visual that's taking 15, 20 seconds to load, even just you viewing it, load testing isn't going to do you any favors because you already know there's a problem. We also need to make sure we're controlling all of our other variables, so things like data volume, CPU, network latency, conference Wi-Fi. These are all things that you need to make sure you control when doing your load testing so you get fair results. And then we can set it up. So let's set our objectives. What are we actually testing? What is our benchmark that we want to set? And how do we know whether a load test actually is giving good results or bad results? Like, what's our SLA with that? We can then identify what report usage is common. So what filters, slicers, bookmarks are commonly used within that report, and make sure that we've embedded those into our load testing to make it realistic. And then we can actually set it up and execute. So let's define our variables up front. Let's run our tests using the realistic load test tool, and then actually analyze those. Now, before I get into the actual tool itself, you might want to just pause and consider whether you even need to use the tool. Because you could, in theory, just do this yourself. You could get a few friends round, open a couple of beers, and all just hit a report at the same time and see what happens, right? Have a bit of a load test party. While that might tell you you've got an issue, because for some of your users it's not loading very well, it's not really going to give you a benchmark. It's not going to give you any actual results unless one of you gets a stopwatch out and is really, really quick. So what I'm going to show you is an automated tool that will not only run the tests for you using the parameters that you preset, but it will actually record all of the results, all the average refresh times, and then a Power BI report that I've built kind of uses that output and gives you a sort of nice visual display of that. So what is the Realistic Load Test tool? Well, it came out only 4 years ago, and no one really seems to know what it is. And it's an open source tool. It's on the Microsoft GitHub. And essentially, what it is a set of PowerShell scripts, and it replicates multiple users opening your Power BI report in a browser window at the same time. So as you'll see when I do the demo, we're going to get lots of different browser windows popping up. I mean, you're going to see the refreshes going through, and you'll get all the results in an Excel format. What the PowerShell scripts will ask is a few questions, so essentially help you set your load tests up. So how many users do you want to replicate this for? How many refreshes do you want the load test to do? And then do you want to add in any more realistic things like switching between report pages, using filters or bookmarks? The version of this that I'm going to show you is slightly different from the one Microsoft give on their GitHub. Essentially, I've forked their code into my GitHub, made a few amendments in collaboration with a colleague of mine, and it's just got a couple of basically new additions. But the one that Microsoft have on their GitHub is perfectly fine as well. It does pretty much the same thing. So to do this, what are you going to need? Well, you need to be able to run PowerShell with that elevated access, so running as admin. You need read access to a report that you want to test. And I say good enough CPU and memory. This really is a bit of trial and error on your part. Generally, in the documentation, they recommend don't run more browser windows than you have cores on your machine. So if you're running for like 5 users and you have, I don't know, a 6-core machine, then you're probably fine. That's just a rule of thumb, so it's probably a bit of trial and error. And then we need the scripts, so I'll show you where to get those. So enough slides. Let's get into some demos. So firstly, I'm just going to show you how the tool actually works, how you run through the PowerShell scripts. Then I'll go for a bit more of a realistic scenario using bookmarks and filters. And then I'll show you, if I have time, how we can actually use this to plan for a Power BI or Fabric capacity. So first of all, as I said, you can find the tool on the Microsoft GitHub page, or you can go to my GitHub and find it on there. Essentially, in here, what you'll get is a nice README file which gives you all of the information about how the tool works. But the most important bit to read is these different PowerShell scripts and files that you get when you download the scripts. So first one being a setup load test script. So this is where it's going to prompt you with questions about how you want to set up your load test. You're also going to get a run load test script. So running this one is actually going to run your tests, and you'll see it happen on your machine. And then you've got a couple of JSON files, one of which is just a access token, one of which is a report JSON, which is storing all your parameters that you've set when you're in the setup script. And then lastly, you'll get HTML, which is basically a sample version of what you're going to see when you run the load test. So it's almost like a test to see that it actually opens in the browser and then you set your load test up correctly. I'm not going to go through all the rest of the prereqs in here. I'll leave them for you to read yourselves, but it's definitely worth reading through. OK, so let's do a test, shall we? I've got a Power BI report. This is actually one of Microsoft's sample reports. So if it's really slow, you can blame them and not me. And also if it breaks, it's not my problem. And it's a simple report. You can download this on the Power BI service for free. It's a sample report. And I'm just going to show you how the load test works with this. So as I said, I'm going to run PowerShell as admin. And then I'm going to change my directory to where I've stored my load test scripts. Hopefully you can see that Let me zoom in a bit. So the first thing we need to do is actually set up our load script. So we run the setup load test PowerShell. And this is now going to ask us a set of different questions about our load test, as I mentioned. So how many reports do we want to configure? I'm just going to do one, but you can set this up to do multiple reports at the same time if you want to. How many views do you want to generate per report? So this is how many times do you want it to actually refresh through the report? So let's do a healthy 7. How many users do we want to replicate? So this is basically how many browser windows do we want to pop up and have concurrently refreshing. So let's go with 4. And then a think time. So obviously users don't just click around a report, well, you hope. They don't just click around a report as fast as they can. You hope they're actually thinking about what they're seeing on the report and then navigating through it. So you can add a bit of think time here, and that's basically just going to add a delay between each refresh. So I'm just going to leave that as 0 for now, but I would recommend adding that in when you actually run the test. Let's just call this 7 users, SQL bits. And it's then going to authenticate. So it only does this once, but it's going to ask you to authenticate, and then it's going to give you a list of all the workspaces that you have access to. I don't know how well you can see that. And then you just give the index of the workspace you want to use. And then this is the little bit that I've added in to the code, which isn't on the Microsoft one. It's going to go away and retrieve your capacity information. At the moment, I'm not running this workspace on a capacity, so it's just going to tell me there's no capacity. You're just running this as a pro user, so that's fine. As I'll show you later, you can run this, and it will show you your capacity if you are connected to one. So now I'm just going to select my report, and it's going to go away and do loads of cool stuff in the background, and it's going to generate a load test folder for us. So in my directory, if I refresh this, I should get a new folder. And as you'll see, this has been time-stamped with the date and the exact time and minute. And then within here, as I mentioned before, we get 3 files. So first one is our Power BI report JSON, and that is going to store all of our parameters that we set in our setup load script, so the number of views, number of users. And if I wanted to, I could go in here and I could change this. So let's say I just want to run it for 3 users instead. Let's hit save. And then, as I'll show you later, you can add in some more information. We're also getting our PBI token file, which is basically just an Active Directory access token. This basically just means when it pops up all the different browser windows, it doesn't need to re-authenticate every time. It's just going to use this same access token, and this lasts for 60 minutes. There is a PowerShell script within the scripts that allows you to refresh that token if you need to. And then lastly, we've got this realistic load test HTML, and that's just going to show us an example in the browser of what it's going to look like. So as you can see, it's loaded our report, and it looks just like a normal report as you would see in Power BI. You can even navigate through this if you want to. You can play around with it, use the bookmarks. And what it also gives you is all this information at the top. So this is where it captures all of the load test information. So things like the runtime, the number of refreshes, any bookmarks or filters that you've supplied. So as you'll see when I run it now, these will update as it refreshes through, but obviously this is just a static single refresh. So looks like it works, so let's go ahead and run that. So now we run our run load test PowerShell. Now, because I'm looking at this directory which has lots of other load tests that I've set up previously in, if you just run this as it is, I'll just zoom in so you can see, it's going to run every single load test that you've produced already, that you've set up. So I don't want to do that. So what you can do is just take the folder name of the load test you set up and pass that as a parameter. Now, fingers crossed, when I run this, it should work. Last thing it's just going to ask you is just to confirm the number of instances you want to initiate, which is just the number of users or browser windows you want to run. So I think we said 3, so let's run that. Fingers crossed. And what you should see now is a few different browser windows pop up if the Wi-Fi allows. And you can see, if I just focus on one of them, if it wants to work. Yeah, let's look at this one. It's going to refresh that report, and you can see the number of refreshes going up, and it's capturing the average refresh time, but also the refresh of every single one. And it's just going to continue iterating through those until all of them are done, essentially. So it looks like it's finished. I can just go back, hit enter, and it closes those down for me. Now what we get is a really, really, really nicely formatted Excel file. Yeah, that's all in the first cell. But what this does have is all the information that you saw on those browser windows. So it's got our runtime, it's got our bookmarks, it's got our refresh times. Luckily for you guys, I've created a Power BI report which runs some queries which actually formats that out. So if I hit refresh on my report here, we've got our new load test from just now. And actually we can see our report ran pretty well, only 3.65 average. I won't spend too much time on this report. I've put it into my GitHub so you can download it and check it out. Obviously, you'll need to change the connection strings to your local directory rather than mine. But I've set a couple of things in here, such as you can set an SLA. So if you've got a performance SLA of, say, 2 seconds, you can easily see which ones have failed and passed. You can filter it by what SKUs you're using, the number of users, your report and your workspace, etc. So definitely quite useful if you just want to get those results into a Power BI report as quickly as possible. This is probably a good place to start, even if it might not give you everything you need. Okay, so that was one example. Now I'm going to show how we can actually add some bookmarks and filters. So we had our report open, and if I take a look at the bookmarks here, I've pre-created a couple of bookmarks. One's called last 12 and one's called last 90. Essentially, it's going to either show you the last 12 months or the last 90 months. And I'll show you, if I flick between those, it should show you how the page changes. Now what you can do is actually grab the bookmark GUID from the URL at the top here. So it's right at the end of the string. If I copy that out, what I can then do is put it into that report JSON file that I showed you. So I've already exported these out, and essentially when you see this bookmark list here, all you need to do is just list all the bookmarks that you want your load test to iterate through. So I've done that here. I'm just going to copy that in. Hit save. So now when it runs a load test, it will iterate through those bookmarks. But we also might want to add some filters in. You can find the schema for the JSON in the GitHub as well, but I've just sort of pre-created one. If you look back at the report that we had, there was a slicer at the bottom right here, and what I'm basically going to get it to do is just iterate through some of these slicer options. So let's copy that code in and add it to the report JSON. So we're just going to use the exact same load test that we did before. So let's save that. Probably what you would want to do in practice is set up a new load test and then so go through the whole process again. But just for speed, I'm going to just do it on the same one. Let's just check in our folder that everything's going to work okay. Yep, it looks good. As you can see, it's applied one of our bookmarks for us. It's applied the slicers. So if I now run this load test again, what we should now get, oh, forgot to, there we go, is, I'll just focus on one of them, is you should get all of the slicers and the 2 bookmarks being iterated through. Let's have a look at this one. That one's finished. Let's have a look at this one. Okay, so as you can see, It's iterating through the different bookmarks, and it's also changing the slicer value in the bottom right there. I don't know how well you can see it, but you might have to just take my word for it. So that gives you a little bit more of a realistic scenario, right? It's not just refreshing the same page over and over again. I also just wouldn't recommend refreshing the page without changing the queries in general, because it's going to cache. So you're not really getting a realistic result there. By changing the queries each time, you're almost resetting the cache. Okay, so I think those are finished. Let's check in our report that it's come through. And yeah, it's the same one as before. Okay. How long have we got? Got loads of time. Okay. So I don't know if many people know this, but you can actually spin up a capacity in Microsoft Azure in the portal as a temporary capacity. You don't need to go and sign up to a monthly or an annual commitment with Microsoft. I think this is up to date. This is the Fabric capacity list. And as you can see, you've got your monthly amount, but also you get an hourly amount. So if you're in a scenario where you're starting to do a Power BI project, or you might want to use Power BI Premium or Fabric, you can use this as a bit of a guide, as a starting point to see where you actually might want to start your testing. So I'm just going to take you through that process. So in Azure, you can go in and create a new Fabric capacity. So let's just do that. Actually, firstly, what I'll show you is the workspace that we are using is this workspace. No, it's not. It's this one. And in this workspace, we are not on any premium capacity, right? We're just using ourselves as a pro user. We have got a premium per user trial, but I'm not going to use that. And you can see all the other capacity options are grayed out, so we can't use any capacities. We don't have any. If we go into Azure and create one, so let's just quickly do that. SQL bits. Load testing. And then we get the choice of a SKU level. Now, I'm not made of money, so I'm going to put this on the lowest possible. And then you'll see when I create it, we can actually scale it up and down as we like. So I'm going to quickly create that. It should only take a few seconds. And then what you'll see when we go back to the Power BI workspace is that now we have another option. We actually have this Fabric capacity available. So that's finished. And fingers crossed, if I refresh this, we should now get a Fabric capacity. Yes, we do. So I'm going to select that, apply, and now we're in a Fabric capacity. So if I go back to the capacity and have a look, you can actually change the size of this as and when you like, ignoring that cost because that's a monthly level, but you saw before I showed you the hourly levels. So if you just wanted to do a load test for, say, half an hour, say, you could specify one of these capacities, do your load tests, and then you can just pause the capacity. So it's very low cost in the short term if you just want to do some quick load testing. So let's give that a quick go. I'm going to just quickly set up a new load test. And let's see how it actually runs on our F2 capacity. Okay, so let's go back to our workspace. And what it should do now is actually tell us that we are on a capacity, and it's brought back our SKU level as well. So that's quite handy. That's probably the main piece of functionality that the Microsoft scripts in their GitHub doesn't have, which mine does. So if we just quickly run that for one of these reports, I'm expecting this to be quite slow, but we shall see. Fingers crossed. Didn't check the HTML, so we're flying blind. Okay, so it's brought it back. It's loading, actually, weirdly quickly. Yeah, that was actually rapid. I'm now worried, did I put it on a really high capacity? No, it's on F2. Okay, fair enough. Maybe it's just a really quick report. We'll say that. I'll just let that quickly run through. While I do so, is there any questions? No? Stunned silence. Okay. So that's all loaded through. Now when I go back to my Power BI report and hit refresh, we can see we've got our new load test done on our nice F2 capacity, and we get our results like that. I could then go back, and before I forget and cost myself some money, I go and pause this capacity to make sure it can't be used. So that's kind of it for the demos. Hopefully that's made sense in terms of how it actually works. Hopefully it's not too scary. I know a lot of people get scared by PowerShell, but really this is all set up for you. So some considerations with this. You need to think about how good your actual estimate is. So lots of people think, oh, well, we've got 100 users that have access to that report. We need to load test for all 100. That's not really the case, is it? Because the chances of all of the 100 users concurrently using a report is quite unlikely unless they're all sat in a meeting together just spamming it. Make sure you've captured all the relevant queries. So if there's any hidden bookmarks or buttons within your report that actually users use quite a lot, they're worth capturing to make sure you embed within your load test. And then also think about your local machine as a potential bottleneck. As I mentioned before, generally in the documentation it recommends don't run more browser windows than you have physical cores on your machine. If that is the case, or you want to do some high-scale load testing, you might want to look at something like a VM, and that might control your environment a little bit more than a local machine where you've got lots of other things going on, people spamming you on Teams, etc. And then lastly, think about how realistic your test environment actually is. If you're doing this so that you can be safe when you're going into production, you kind of need to make your test environment as similar to production as possible. There's quite a lot of new announcements over the last sort of 6 months or so in terms of Fabric capacities. There's loads of new features such as smoothing, which helps when your capacity is throttled. So it's definitely worth checking out the articles and documentation around that. There is a really handy capacity metrics app that you get in the service, and what this basically gives you is information around when your capacity is nearing its limit with this sort of graph in the top right, but also you can see which data sets are causing you issues, which users are running queries against certain data sets which are causing issues, and you can look at this at a sort of 5-minute time frame. This is exactly what I used when I mentioned earlier about my issue at work where someone was running a demo with the tooltips. I basically went into here, saw the spike, drilled through, and found that a certain user was kind of spamming the report. It won't necessarily tell you, it won't tell you what the query actually is, but it can give you that starting point to go and investigate. There's lots of other use cases for this. So if you wanted to test how the performance was when you use things like RLS, so using users that have RLS enabled, just run the load test using their account, see how it performs. You could do some regression testing, as I mentioned earlier, look at your pre and post results to see how they compare when deploying code. And then something that I would really like to look into is load testing some Direct Lake mode reports to see actually how good is it. This was sort of very recently announced. You can now switch between Direct Lake and Direct Query within your Power BI reports. So again, something that I'll definitely want to look at to see how we can load test by making that switch within the report dataset. Obviously, this is a local-only solution at the moment. You need to run it on a machine, but you obviously could use a virtual machine, etc. You could look to do something by putting it into the cloud, embed it within your DevOps pipelines, for example. That could be quite handy. It is obviously using PowerShell scripts, so if it fails, you may need to know how to actually fix that. But generally, it's pretty user-friendly, but there could be a way to improve it into more of a low-code solution. One thing I'm planning to do at work is embed this into pull requests. So if you're trying to publish a report to production from test, there's a gateway check that says, have you done your load testing? If you have, here, please show the results to make sure that nothing gets pushed into production that potentially could have any issues. Lastly, I showed you all of the visual loading within load testing, but what you might want to do is actually combine it with something like SQL Profiler or Log Analytics or the Metrics Capacity app, which actually gives you information about how the queries are running on the actual data set itself in the background. Then you'll know, is it more of a data set issue, i.e. our code isn't very performant, or is it a report issue where we've maybe got too many visuals on a page, for example. So that's definitely useful. I'll just round up by sort of summarizing. Hopefully you've learned a little bit about what load testing actually is if you've never heard of it, why we should care about it and why I think it's really important, and how to actually do that in Power BI. So hopefully you can take this back with you and actually run some load tests against your reports. I'm a little bit early finishing there, so we've got plenty of time for questions. These are all my details if you want to find me online. As I said, if you're ever in the Northeast, please do come along to the user group. And I really appreciate any feedback if you have any for me. Thank you. Was there any questions? If you have a gateway enabled on your data set, will it have any effect with the load testing? Essentially, no. As long as the report still works in the service, there's no reason why the load test wouldn't work in the same way. Any more questions? So the question was, what function within the business does this sit in? Is it more devs or QA? I guess it kind of depends on your setup. Personally, as a manager of a Power BI team, I would rather do this myself, especially when you know or have some context about how the report's been built. You might be able to spot those performance issues a lot quicker. But if you have like a fully fledged set up QA team that knows their way around all of this, I don't see why they couldn't take it on board.